Hi, welcome. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications. And today we are interviewing a poet laureate from Detroit named Nandi. How are you doing today?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining. When you think of home, you think of Detroit. How, with traveling with your job, it's got to be cool to visit different places, but you never see yourself living anywhere else. You were born and raised here.
Well, I've lived a couple of places. I lived in Mexico once. I lived in different parts of the Midwest, and I lived out east. But I've always called Detroit home. Recently, I feel like I feel more and more connected to home. I grew up at a time when everyone told us that we had to leave Detroit, we had to leave Michigan in order to find success. But in the last couple of years, I found a way in which I really have been able to just have a healthy life in Detroit and a really strong community in Detroit. Even the Detroiters that I know that have left, we all really love being from our city. We love the community that's here and the kind of spirit that's here. So while I won't go on record to say that I can't imagine myself living anywhere else because I've lived other places and it would be odd if I didn't find myself living somewhere else, but I will always have a connection to Detroit, always.
Would you say that your connection and why you find Detroit so special is because with people?
Yeah, I think that for a long time, Detroit has been a space where we are a city that doesn't have a lot of resources. We're not a wealthy city. Most of us are working class. And for a lot of cities, that's a difficult thing to imagine to be in a space where a lot of people are maybe in need. Um, but I think that kind of sometimes some people might call it lacking or drought, but I think it means that we just have a different relationship to institutions. We have a different relationship to resources. We believe that we can make it ourselves. If it isn't there, we'll just do it ourselves. And so I really have noticed that in other places that it's not as strong as how Detroiters do it. Like if there's not a park, I've known people that just built their own park because they knew that there wouldn't be resources that would just miraculously give them a park, but that didn't mean that the need wasn't there. So I feel like, in a sense, Detroiters are also witnessing a different kind of life than other people around the country. That's not to say that other communities aren't as vibrant and beautiful. I just find Detroit to have a very different culture in the way that our artists produce, and I feel really at home in it.
In most events, you'll also find that it's not one person, it's a group of people at almost every event that get through it, that make it. And I feel like the teamwork and collaboration makes it feel like home too. Like here's an event, we've created it. Like it's all from our city. We're not getting outside help. Like it's all
Yeah, yeah, and I think that the way that we think is it makes me feel like home. Whereas like I've been in other cities, I've been in other literary scenes, and they're all have their own importance. I just there's a way in which Detroiters value one another's voices and find themselves supporting one another, knowing that we're all interested in doing something different. And I think we are also we're not anti-establishment, we just don't have establishment. And so there isn't a blueprint for the way that we work. We don't try to imitate each other, and we don't try to make it a standard in the Detroit way. So like if you look at Detroit poets, I don't think any of us really sound alike. I don't think there's our Detroit school is just that we came from the same area, but not necessarily that we are even operating in the same ways.
in all the places that you've traveled because of being a poet. What are some of those places and how has the community felt different there than versus Detroit?
Mm. I want to answer the first question, the second question first, and that I think that it's important when you feel like a place is home. And so when you go to another place and knowing that you're an outsider, knowing that you don't have your roots there takes a long time to establish yourself as someone from an area. And I think that that's really what is the difference between my experience in other cities and Detroit. That said, I've been able to find community in places like Guadalajara, Mexico, where I lived for 3 years and where I go back to often to spend significant amounts of time there. Um, I also go to Vermont. I go to several small towns in Vermont where I have my chosen family members. I've not lived, I lived in Indiana for grad school, and I have some chosen family in Indiana as well, but I've visited, traveled, and lived all over the world. So I've lived in Spain, I visited South Africa, Ghana, Germany, Nepal. And the one thing that I know about once you start talking about going into the international world, um, there's an identity that gets that your American identity is what is faced forward. And I think that's very different than when I visit communities in the United States, whereas like I might consider myself first African American and find myself very much thinking about Black communities around the country, and look for them even and seek them out even. But once you live in a place where there aren't there many Black people, you realize that there are a lot of different ways in which you find community. So I find my community amongst writers. One of the places that I went to in South Africa was I went to the Chudikure um, uh, journals offices to meet the people that work on that journal. And or like when I was in Nepal, I was assisting a writer with his writing workshop. So it's a different sense of community when you go in places. And I'm also very aware of the privilege that I have as an American traveling in a lot of these places where there are a lot of people who don't have that privilege as well.
What is your schedule like?
Well, my writing schedule is I try to keep a steady writing schedule so that I can accomplish my writing goals and my assignments. I usually tend to like write in the mornings for several hours, reading and writing in the mornings for several hours, and then I end every day with reading and writing. But based on if I have an event, I usually will make time in my schedule for how to prepare for an event, depending on what kind of event it is. Sometimes I'll visit schools for a full day and I don't have much time to write during the day. So every day is really different this year, which is very strange for me because I was someone who I'm very much feel much more comfortable with ritual and habitual kind of schedules that, this is my schedule for the day and, maintaining that schedule. And so it's been actually quite challenging to maintain some of the ways in which I most comfortably work. But I think upturning your ritual is also very fruitful for a writing life. And so it means that I'm much more I plan more and I try to be more conscientious about how and where I will write and what I am doing and what I will commit to.
Do you feel like having a set schedule is better for your mental health, or do you believe that when you set yourself a tight schedule and you feel like you're forced to follow it, can it be draining?
It just depends on what kind of activity it is. If I know that I'll have a break, I like to try to set some intentions for that break. If I'm going to have a tight schedule, I like to know that like when will this schedule start? When will it end? So that I can set time for a break. So right now, for the last 2 months, I was on the road. In October, I went from going up to the Upper Peninsula to doing an event in Lansing to doing a lot of things, right? So I was traveling a lot. But I also knew that like between one event and another event that I would be at home and I wanted to take advantage of that time. And so it's really important to me, as long as I know when there is a break, I am really good. It's good for my mental health to know that if I make this investment now, then I will have time later. And I tend to schedule a week or so that I can come back home and restore myself and, be prepared to be out there in the public eye again.
What inspired you to become a poet?
I don't know that I was ever necessarily inspired to be a poet. I think I've always, for a long time, felt writing was important to me. And there's something I always use this term about, I just really enjoy when my brain gets set on fire, whether when I read something engaging or when I'm writing and I get a lead that is something that I feel like, oh, this is something I want to explore more. The practice of intellectual play is really interesting to me. And I think that if I weren't a poet, I would be involved in some other kind of scholarly work. And so I get really excited about studying and seeing things that resonate with me. And so I don't know that there was a particular moment that clicked for me. I just know that I just kept experiencing joy from literature. And I thought, well, this is something that you should continue to pursue.
Do you ever have writer's block?
No, I believe I write bad things all the time, but I write through it. I don't, I think oftentimes if I feel like I don't feel compelled. I always have an assignment that I've given myself. So even when I'm writing, I'll decide, like right now, I'm writing some poetry about something that happened in Detroit in the 1990s. And so that is my assignment. If ever I feel like I can't write anything, I can go back to my research and I can go back to reading. And I always advise people that are having problems with writer's block to do two things: to really set a goal to write every day, no matter what it is, just to write something down, and that they need to be reading more than they're writing. And so if you're writing for an hour, then you should be reading for 2 hours so that you're giving yourself more, you're feeding yourself more than you're producing. And believe me, to read broadly, read science magazines, read history, read fiction, read anything so that you can be compelled to respond, and you will find. I would say sometimes if I think the play with language is very important. And so sometimes I go back to poems and I try to figure out how that writer did it and see if I can do my own version of it, not to necessarily plagiarize them, but to honor them and to also be in the play of writing, because I think that you should be probably, if you have a poem out, you should have written 50 other drafts before that one poem came out, because not of that poem, but just that you wrote. You just kept writing, and this is the cream of the crop of what you wrote that we get to see later. I write a lot of mess. I write a lot of awful stuff. And then I decide, okay, that's a part of the process.
Is there a spot other than your books, which we'll talk more about in a bit, where people can see some of your writing?
Mhm. Yeah, I have some poems online that everyone, if you just Google me, Nandi Comer, you can find my work online.
How did you get into poetry?
I had a high school teacher who asked me into a creative writing class, and I really enjoyed it. And so I started writing that way. And then I had a mentor later on in my life who helped me understand how to professionalize myself.
Can you name the teacher and the mentor?
My high school teacher was Terry Blackhawk. She later founded this organization called Inside Out Literary Arts Project that puts professional writers in the schools. But when she was my high school teacher, she used to invite her poetry friends in to teach creative writing. And so I met a lot of writers that way. And then she would always give us writing exercises to do, and I really enjoyed it. And so that was really great. And then when I was 25, I came back to Detroit, and I was frequenting a lot of open mics and just really enjoying being around poets. And there was another poet, Vivi Francis, who invited me to take a class that she and another poet, Christina Archer, were shaping, called Right Word, Right Now. And all of the people that were involved in that class, we would go to Vivi's house every 2 weeks or once a month to really just soak up all of the knowledge that she had accumulated over some time on her own, to learn about not only how to craft our own poems, but she also gave us an intro on what we could do with our writing if we wanted to be more professional. And so she introduced us to literary journals and introduced us to festivals and conferences, and it really helped me to make a decision to pursue my writing further, and I decided to go to grad school after that.
You've written two books. Can you tell us the title of those, a synopsis of them, and what inspired you to write those books?
Sure. My first book is American Family, a Syndrome. And that book is a very short book. It was written around the time that I was experiencing a lot of grief personally. Um, and then at the same time, there's some poems in there that also talk about it is my response to some of the racialized violence that we've seen in the last couple of years, probably now about 10 years of not just racialized cases of racialized violence, but also this shift to where we get to where we're seeing it on the internet and where we're seeing it online in kind of these personal documentaries. And so I was experiencing that. And so I wrote a lot of poems about how what effect that has on the human psyche, on the American psyche. And so American Family Syndrome is one that I'm pretty proud of. The second book is Tapping Out. So American Family is a small book. It's a chapbook. And this book is my first full-length collection, Tapping Out. Tapping Out is most of the poems are about Mexican wrestling, but a lot of the poems in here also have to do with language acquisition, with traveling abroad, with race and gender and love. And so I use the motif of the mask as a way to explore some other topics.
What does being the first poet laureate in Detroit after 60 years?
So I am the first, I'm only the second poet laureate in history to serve the state of Michigan. And yes, there were 60 years in between. I don't think I even have all fully comprehended what it means to me. It has meant so much. Um, it means a lot to me that my state has decided to focus on poetry, to set a significant amount of focus on poetry by not only hiring me to advocate for poetry, to plan poetry programs across the state, but to also celebrate the poetry that has come out of the state. So one of my favorite things to do is I get to give away books written by Michigan poets at all of the events that I go to. So it's not, it takes the focus off of me so much, but also I think it's important that it's a Detroiter, because Detroit writers are really making significant moves around the world, but also for me, it's really significant because I come from a community that oftentimes feels like their voices are overlooked. And so it really means a lot to me that the state believed that somebody like me from my community could serve as someone could be of service to the state for an art form like poetry, which is so rich and beautiful.
How did you even apply or necessarily get through the process of becoming a poet laureate?
That's the thing. I didn't apply. Someone nominated me. Someone put my name in the hat, and they asked me to send them my materials. But she didn't tell me that's what I was sending my materials for. She asked me to send her a couple of things that would help to describe the work that I've been doing for the last couple of years. And I sent my CV. And then 2 weeks later, she said, well, I nominated you for Michigan Poet Laureate. And I was like, oh, wow. And then there was a little bit of some forms that I had to fill out, but I learned from the Library of Michigan, which is the office that appointed me, I learned from the Library of Michigan that I beat out all the other candidates and that they wanted me to serve. And I was in shock. I couldn't believe it because poet laureates are usually people who are older, who have had like 5, 6, 7 books, and it's kind of a lifetime achievement recognition. And so to have this kind of recognition was really unexpected. But once they started to talk to me a little bit more about what they wanted the program to do, it made sense why I was chosen. I have a lot of experience doing programming and planning events and youth programming. So it was really made sense.
What does being the first African American poet laureate mean to you?
Oh, it means a lot. I don't think that I set out to make historical moves. I only wanted to do art in a way that was respectful, that is the highest form of art that I can produce. Um, and so for me, it is very important to be thinking about Black voices as representation of American culture. Almost so much of American culture finds its roots in Black culture, rock and roll, pop music, the blues, some of the ways in which we even some of the sayings and how we even use like the internet and things like that are rooted in Black culture. And so I feel like it only makes sense that I as a Black woman, am able to represent my state. But also, I think that Black women have oftentimes have stories that are overlooked. And this is an opportunity for me to highlight the stories of Black women as well.
Are you working on a third book?
I'm always working on poems. So I don't like to commit to a project that I don't have yet. But I do have a lot of poems around some themes that I'm working on, and I'm hoping to shape that into my third book by the end of next year. So next year around this time, I plan to have at least a manuscript.
Can you share what some of those, what the topic of your next book will be?
Sure. So I've been writing a lot of poems about my childhood. And I specifically have been thinking about the decades from 1990 to the year 2000. Um, I was a I went from 10 years old to 20 years in that time. And so I've been writing a lot of personal narrative poems. I've also been writing some things around, like I said, there was an incident that happened in Detroit. A man by the name of Malice Green was killed by the police. I've been doing some research around that. I'm not sure how much of those poems will make it into these ideas, and I'm not sure that it's a full-length collection yet, but I've just been very happy writing poems. After writing 2 books, and having several projects that I've done, it's been nice to just focus on the single poem more than the book.
What is your process for writing?
I write every day. I try to wake up in the morning by like 5:30, 6 a.m. and I try to write for about 2 hours. I write until I get something, and then I usually start with handwriting in my notebook. And then if I feel like it's promising, I might work on it for a couple of days and then I'll leave it alone. I'll work on other things and then I'll come back to it. Um, and then honestly, if I'm really honest, deadlines are usually what gets me to finish it.
What styles do you write in?
Most of my writing is free verse. I've actually started writing a lot of abecedarian poems lately, which is very odd for me. I usually think that the abecedarian is quite gimmicky, but I was thinking a lot about, I was thinking a lot about bra sizes. And so they go in the they go in an alphabetical sequence. And it made sense for me to start writing an abecedarian poem, which is how I approach form. I usually allow the poem to tell me what kind of form it needs, but I start in free verse usually. I'm very much interested in lyric and how things sound. Not just, and I tell stories, I do a lot of narrative writing, but I'm really interested in sound and how I can really make a poem have a lyric kind of song to it.
That's very important. Engagement to it's important in an
Mhm.
article. It's usually, what is it? Like the first line of any piece of writing is what will hook people.
Mhm. Mhm. The first line or sentence always. It's so important. I mean, if you think, I think sometimes poems are very different than like novels because they're all very different. And so that's kind of why I'm resistant against the book right now, because I think oftentimes if we're only thinking about the book, then we will neglect the details of each individual poem that need to be there. I want to make sure every single poem that I consider for a book is there because it is a good poem and not um purely because I'm trying to finish a book.
What are some places, communities, or people that you've inspired?
Oh, I don't know. That's really difficult. People have told me I'm inspiring, but I think those communities would have to tell you that I've been inspired by a lot of communities. I really enjoyed being up in the Upper Peninsula this fall because I had no idea what to expect, and it seems really like a different place than anything I've been to in the Lower Peninsula. Even though I traveled a lot over the Lower Peninsula before being appointed to the Michigan Poet Laureate position. But I was also very like just surprised to see the kind of community that was in the Holland High School. They were just all kind of demographics. I had some Spanish speakers in the classroom and I'm fluent in Spanish, so I got to like speak in Spanish to some of the kids, and I brought some of my Mexican wrestling mask and they were really like receptive to it. Recently I was in Berrien Springs, where I got to meet some eighth graders that were just great. Like we were in a library and we got to write poems, and there were some students that were great actors as well. So I feel very much inspired by my audience more so. I've also met other poet laureates in the state. So one thing that's been really great is like the UP has a poet laureate, Lansing has a poet laureate, Grand Rapids has a poet laureate. So I've been able to meet these poets and it's been so good. I just like learning about their work, listening to those poems. I think no matter what, no matter how many books I write, I'm always going to be more a fan of other poets than like thinking about my own work. If I don't write another poem, I'll be at home with the library that I am building, just reading the work of other people.
How do you believe poetry or books should be taught or introduced?
I tend to think that poetry is taught in like the a backwards way. I think that we should teach contemporary poetry first because I think that oftentimes the language of a different time is very difficult for students who have never encountered it before. And I think that in order to really engage writers, I think it's really important that they read people, especially, I would say, especially adolescents. I think it's important that you read people that speak the same generational language as you. And so when I teach high schools, when I go into high schools or middle schools, I tend to not teach dead poets because I think that that's, in a way, it will shock students to know that poems can be mundane. Poems can be about anything, and that poets write in the language that they speak in. I think oftentimes younger writers, they tend to write these lofty ways because they've only been taught Shakespeare or Donne, and that's great. But I think that that is in a way it teaches a different it teaches poetry from a different time. And I don't think that's the way that a student that a poem can resonate with a student. I don't think it's impossible, but I think the average student nowadays, especially in TikTok and Instagram, they're looking to see themselves in the work. And so I think it's really important that that students get contemporary writers first before they go back into the past.
And I think that's true, like a good point of like we should learn more current writing styles before going back to the past, but also experiencing them both so that we can see here's how writing's evolved over time.
I think it's also really interesting to learn your literary lineage. And so it's an interesting exercise to take like the poet that you most admire and then look for the poet that influenced them the most, and then look for that poet who influenced that poet the most, because then you might trace it back to Shakespeare, and or you might trace it back to somebody you didn't even know. And so I think but you can see that connection as opposed to just being taught things in a vacuum.
What's your
I think AI is a space for possibility. I think there are some people that are using AI in malicious ways, and I think that that should be really curbed. But I really think that we as creatives, we've always adapted technology in our work. I mean, we didn't write on computers for all the time, and we had a really big dispute over like, is it cheating if you're using spell check, you know? So I think that AI can be resourceful, but I'm interested in seeing I'm interested in artists that are using AI as a tool for collaboration more so than a tool for forgery.
what is your advice for someone who wants to start writing or start a career?
Start reading. Start reading. I think just go off and do it. Start writing and reading now. Take classes, talk to other writers, find a poet, take them out for a cup of coffee and ask them about how they're doing what they're doing. But read books that were written in the last 5 years. Just read what's out there first. See what people are doing, because I think that oftentimes in order to be inventive, you need to know what's out there. If you don't know what's out there, then there's no way that you know that what you're doing is new or not.
What is the hardest part about your job?
Oh, fulfilling everyone's needs. I think that I think that it's been so long, and I think that there are a lot of people that want us to do things. And I say us, I mean like the Library of Michigan, me. Um, I just don't have the time. I can't do it all. And I think that, it's I think it'll be very interesting if like the next poet laureate comes from the midwestern part of the state versus the southeastern part of the state. It's very difficult for me to get up to the UP. It's not terribly difficult, but it takes a lot more planning than like someone can call me and ask me to be somewhere in 3 days in Detroit, and I could probably do it, but I can't do those same kind of things for the UP. And so I wish there were more resources. I wish there were more people. So there's just so much more than what we're going to be able to accomplish this year. But luckily, I know the Library of Michigan is looking forward to appointing their next group of people.
What is the easiest thing about your job?
I get to do poetry. That's like the easiest thing. It is a joy. It is just like I get to wake up every day and know that everything that I'll be doing is dedicated to poems. So that is just the greatest thing, you know.
What's your favorite thing about your job?
My favorite thing about my job is meeting other people that love poetry, meeting other people that love poems, doing events with other poets, just being in a space with people who genuinely just have an interest, even if they're just like curious about poems. Maybe they don't love it, but they're curious. I just love participating and sharing space with those folk.
What is your least favorite part about your job?
Waking up at 6 a.m. to get to an 8 o'clock class. I don't like leaving the house as soon as I wake up. I like to wake up, make my coffee, read, be in, a quiet space for a couple of hours. I am not used to being in a hustle and bustle of a school at 8 o'clock in the morning. But I do it because I know it's important. But that's probably my least important. And probably driving. I have to do a lot of driving.
What is your education?
I went to foreign language immersion and cultural studies, elementary through middle school, where I became bilingual in Spanish. And I think that is so important that Detroit Public Schools get credit for my education. I went on to go to Communication and Media Arts High School, where I started my education in poetry. And then I graduated and went on to the University of Michigan, where I graduated with a degree in English and Spanish with a focus on Latin American studies. And then I took 10 years off. I took 10 years off and I went back to school when I was 30. I went to grad school. I went to Indiana University to do an MFA in poetry and an MA. I have a master's in African American Lit.
Would you say this is your only career?
No, no, actually, I've done a lot of things. I have mainly stayed within the nonprofit sector. I've been a program director. I've been an educator. I started my career as a full-time English teacher in a school in Mexico. So I taught middle school and high school English as a second language. And then I came back and was a writer in residence and kind of moved up to become a program director of the program that I was teaching for. Then I've taught most of my stuff, a lot of it has been in education. So I taught creative writing when I was in grad school. I taught composition when I was in grad school. When I came back to Detroit, I was an accountant for a little while. I served on the accounting team of a nonprofit. And then I went back to doing program director work, but it was a different kind of program director. I was working for Allied Media Projects. So I'm pretty I do a lot of things. So I've only recently, 2 months ago, am only being a poet because being a poet is not very, it doesn't make a lot of money. And so the poet laureate position, along with some plans that I had to take a year away from a 9 to 5, have allowed me to do that now.
I want to thank you for joining. I had a lot of fun. Is there one famous quote you have or a famous sentence that you would like to leave everyone with?
I want to read my favorite poem. It's "Won't You Celebrate With Me" by Lucille Clifton. It goes, "Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and failed."
Could you explain the meaning of that poem?
It's a beautiful poem because she's talking about how she keeps succeeding this in the face of adversity. That last line, "Won't you celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and failed," shows how strong she is. And not just something has tried to destroy her, but something has tried to end her, and that's every single day. Can you imagine? But before that, she talks about how her identity is very much tied to that, to those attempts. And so it reminds me that there's strength, that I have strength, that all of us have strength, and that no matter what we're facing, that it doesn't matter if it's trying to destroy you, it will fail if you wake up the next day.